Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. So I wanted to answer somebody's question that they posed to me earlier. And they asked, like, why does ilm al-ṣarf or morphology, like, why does that matter? Or, how do any of these things, are they just nerd things? Or do they actually have a place? And are they practical? And so I figured I would give an example here, and the example would be to demonstrate actually to show a parallel between Arabic and English, because I think sometimes there's this myth that, like, you'll hear people say all the time, you cannot translate the Quran into English. I mean, this is actually a very ludicrous statement. You can render the meaning of the Quran into the English language. That's what translation means, right? Now, you cannot produce a Quran in Inglesiyan, right? As the Quran says, Inna anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyyan. We revealed it as an Arabic Quran. So we cannot, there will be no revelation of the Quran in Arabic. But the meaning of it obviously can. And I think this is an important, actually, intermediary step or actually even it's an important intermediary step, but it's also an important thing to kind of flag from the very get-go, in that if you don't understand your own language, so for those of us that are native English speakers that are going to learn Arabic as a second language, or in my case as a fourth language, then there's certain things that can, I think, set people off on the wrong path. And so I think that that's really misguiding in some ways. So I'm going to give one example that shows the utility of learning morphology or ṣarf, but B, will also demonstrate that we actually use this all the time in English, but because we're native speakers of English, we don't tend to think of our language in perhaps such a technical way. So for instance, you take the Arabic root of kaf, ba, and ra. Kaf, ba, and ra. And this can be articulated on two forms, ala waznaini, fa'ula wa fa'ila. So this can be articulated on two different morphological formulations, which is when we do this, we often use the three letters of fa, ain, and lam as sort of placeholders, and then we change the vowels on them: the fatha, the damma, the kasra, the sukun, the shadda, and on and on. And then, of course, for some of the other forms, we add letters into it, and so on. So we have fa'ula and fa'ila. And then if we now put in the root that we're working with of kaf, ba, and ra, then we're left with kabura and kabira. So let's do with the first one. Kabira, as it says, right, bi kasr al-ba'i yakbaru. So when we have kabira, which is, of course, in the past tense voice, صيغة الماضي, صيغة الماضية, when that's done in the past tense as what we might think of in English as a kind of infinitive, then we get kabira. And then the mudari', or the present tense conjugation, becomes yakbaru. Yakbaru. And he says, هناك كبر بضمها يكبر. Then, likewise, when we go to the other inflection, which is kabura, right? The difference here, the middle word, the first one, there's a kasra or an e sound on the ba, and the second one, there's a dhamma or an u sound. So kabira and kabura. And he said that when that is also put into the present tense form, then we get yakbura. He says, وَالْفَرْقْ بَيْنَهُمَا. And so what is the difference between the two of these? He says, and kabira bil kasra So when we have the kasra on the second root letter, on the ba, he says معناه زادت سنه كما بقولنا كبر الطفل. So he says that when we have kabira, right, with the kasra on the middle one, then this becomes, or the meaning rather, is what zadat sinnuhu, like when a child grows up, right, when their age increases and also their physical size, because, as children grow in age, they also tend to, right, grow in size. So that is kabira yakbaru. But then he says, kabura, now the ba with the dhamma or the u sound in the middle, بِضَمِّ الْبَاءِ فَمَعَنَاهُ عَظُمًا. Now, under this one, we would say that the meaning here is to increase in non-physicalness, like in majesty or in importance or in some other way that is more, I don't want to just simply say metaphorical, but particularly you could say non-physical. It can be metaphorical, but non-physical. So this is مثل كقولك كبر شأنك في عيني. And so he says, for instance, that when we use kabura, it's like saying that you have grown in stature in my eyes, right? You've become more important. You've grown in stature. That doesn't mean you physically, right? And so this word is the kind of like majazi, kind of metaphorical part, right? It doesn't mean that you physically grew because, it's not like you grew before my eyes, right? But the importance of you or the matter concerning you as a person, you've grown in my eyes. And so he gives the example from the Quran. He says, مثلا كقوله تعالى كبرت كلمة تخرج من أفواههم. So this is from Surah Al-Kahf, the 18th chapter. And so when Allah says, وَقَالَ اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا, and the pagans make the claim, as well as the Christians, but actually more particular here, the pagans, they claim that Allah Ta'ala has taken a son, that God has a son or God has a child or has children. And Allah's response to this is what kaburat. So this is the second one, right? Kaburat kaliban takhruju min afwahihim. That the words that come out of their mouths are enormous, right? Adhuma. They're massive. It doesn't mean the letters like a comic book where you have a thought balloon and the letters are getting bigger. No, not in that way. But the gravity or the subject of what they're saying, in this particular, the sin, the immorality of what they're saying is enormous. And so we have one that relates to physical, literal change, and another that can relate to more of the metaphorical kind of way. إِن يَقُولُونَ إِلَّا كَذِبًا, as Allah says, right? And what they're saying is just nothing other than a lie. And so this demonstrates the importance of why ṣarf, morphology, is an important subject to be studied. And I think this is what tends to, in some ways, hold people at the beginner level. People they get into Arabic 101, maybe they graduate to 102 or 201, and then they become stagnant at that stage. And this is unfortunate because what happens is, what happens with this is that it in some ways it stunts the development of the morphological, grammatical, linguistic development of a person's linguistic intuition, if you would, right? So instead of having to learn everything purely through rote memorization and purely trying to memorize this word and that word, of course, vocabulary is an extremely important part of cultivating one's understanding of any language, Arabic, Spanish, Japanese, whatever, of any language, obviously. But then how does one do that? Then marrying that with the objective to read the Quran and to be able to understand the complexities and the nuances. So you might think, for instance, Um, for instance, when we say takbir, right, and people's response is Allahu Akbar. So takbir being the masdar of which one? Of kabura or kabira? Of kabira, right? Because, although there could be an argument made, for the latter, right? And this is where sometimes you'll find the nahwiyun, right? The scholars of grammar, they will have their competing ideas and theories, right? But when Allah Ta'ala says kaburat kalimatan takhruju min afwahihim in yaquluna illa kadhiban, now we understand that Allah is talking about what? Ta'zeem. He's talking about the enormity of what they're saying. So when you use kabura, right? Yakbura, then you're dealing with ideas, concepts. And this is something very, very important. So when you're reading the Quran and you're seeing this, and of course, takbir really actually comes from al-wazn athani, right, from the second form of fa'ala or kabbara, right? So I mean, technically, it's from the second form. But this is important. So when you go through the Quran and you see instances of kabura, understand now that it's talking about things of ideas, concepts. Of course, what is the primal concept of the Quran? La ilaha illallah, tawheed, right? The oneness of Allah. And so when we see in many of the verses and in many of the ayat, they are referring to what? Things that people are saying or uttering that are enormously erroneous. And that's why Allah says, In yaquluna illa kadhiban. What they're saying is so heinous, it's essentially a lie. It's not only a lie because it's, obviously it's a lie because it's not true. It's kadhab. But it's also it's not purely on the literal facts, but also the metaphorical, the repercussions of saying such a thing. So Allah Ta'ala says, when they say that kind of things, it's as if the heavens would rip themselves asunder, rip themselves apart at such a enormous, right, miscarriage of truth. So this is just one example of why studying ṣarf is an important thing. And recently I happened to acquire, of course, I don't know where I put them now because I have, I don't know, I have so many books, man, it's really hard to keep track. But I recently acquired a book that I think is a good beginner book if you have the capacity to learn in the Arabic. Now, if you don't have the capacity to learn in the Arabic, I think that this is actually where we need, this is where some work needs to be done in the community of people producing books and translations and, putting out books, is that I feel that there isn't really a good beginner book of morphology. And this is a problem because I think sometimes there's this idea that, well, you learn grammar, and then, hopefully later on you'll tackle morphology, ilm al-ṣarf, except that most people never gain the facility to learn enough language, learn enough Arabic to actually further their study of Arabic in Arabic, and they're wholly reliant upon the English. I think there might be a couple of books out there. Again, I could be missing something, but that's just my rough assessment, is that there needs to be like a good beginner book. Perhaps sometimes, maybe in the future, I'll have a chance to do so. But I think also, going back to one of my original points, is that we learn these things. Intuitively as children. When we learn language, we learn through imitation and repeating, and then as we intellectually grow and develop, then we begin to be able to have a more, granular understanding. And I think the way that is most commonly for a lot of people is that they learn language, particularly any second language, they tend to learn it in a very unintuitive and unnatural way. So somebody said, is kabira a type or level of sin? Well, yes. I mean, so you have the kaba'ir, right? You have those major sins, and as Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, if you can avoid those, then inshallah, Allah Ta'ala will forgive you. It'll be much easier for you to be forgiven if you can avoid, right, the major ones. But just going back to, again, when you go through and you read the Quran and you see the instances of kaburat. So kaburat is actually fi sighat al-mu'annath, right? It's in the feminine because it's the verse is talking about their words, their aqwal, which is plural, and so anyway, and of course the word kalima, kalimatan takhruju, kalima mu'annath, right? So kalima is a feminine. So what comes out of the mouth is heinous, and so kaburat, right? And again, these are the things that I think that will develop your appreciation of the Quran. It will give you a true sense of wonderment, but it will also simultaneously improve your own appreciation of your own language, right? And you'll realize that, again, we do these things all the time. In English, we do it, but again, it just tends to be in a more unassuming and more intuitive way because we're native speakers of English. So thought I would leave this here as a little reflection. Hopefully, I don't know, maybe in the future, if people are interested, perhaps I can try to work out doing a series of short videos like this, maybe 5-10 minutes, covering some of these topics to help in the learning of nahu, of grammar, but also of ṣarf, and then of course eventually balagha. But balagha is definitely something to be learned once a person has some facility, in the language itself. So, jazakumullahu khairan. Inshallah, we'll try to see you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.